Hey, this is Dave Douglas, and this is the Greenleaf Music Podcast, A Noise from the Deep, and that's the music of Eric Wubbels, great composer, pianist, one of the members of the Wet Ink Ensemble, and we're going to be listening to his music and talking to him, lots of great insights, brilliant guy. Thank you for listening. Please go and subscribe. Greenleafmusic.com has all these episodes and the entire catalog of music. Thanks for being here, and enjoy this interview with Eric Wubbels. Eric, thank you so much for joining me. It's great of you to make the time.
Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Well, I know how hard you're working, and you must be writing all the time. And we heard a little bit of this 2016 piece, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but Gretchen am Spinnrad, right?
Close enough, yeah.
Close enough. It's a great piece, and I usually start out these conversations sort of, I think the big question, how did you get to that? What brought you to the sound world of that piece? And I know it's a long journey, but where, how did you, what was the beginning of your path, and how did it proceed to that point?
Yeah, sure. I guess if we want to go pretty far back, I started off just as a pianist and did the kind of standard classical training. Though I think early enough on realized that I wasn't going to be at the level of high level soloist. And also that wasn't really where my interests were headed.
And when did you realize you were wrong about that?
Well, I think I just found a different niche for the types of skills and interests that I ended up having.
Interesting.
Which is, it's I think going down that path would be the same as someone who ended up in the Olympics is a very specific, high level athlete. It's such a regimented training. You have to be ready for that from such a young age. That I think one of the things that was mainly driving me after even just a couple of years of studying music was just curiosity about unfamiliar sounds. And that was really always a huge thing that I was chasing, was either novelty or strangeness or, anything that's what really grabbed me, was something that I'd never heard before.
And we're talking from beginning piano,
yes,
classical.
9 years old. Yep.
Did you somehow get exposed to that music? Was it in your house or?
Yeah, my parents were classical music fans, in addition to,
Sure.
Beatles and Paul Simon and kind of the standard, interesting music of their generation. But yeah, that was definitely coming at me from that. But I think when I was getting into into the age where I could have a little bit more choice in terms of what I would be studying with my teachers, even then I was sort of most intrigued by or started seeking out the things that were different or that I had never really heard before. So that I think was kind of ended up really determining the path that I started to
Huh.
follow.
What were those things?
I mean, it probably would be something like Prokofiev,
Oh,
that
wow.
age. It's not that far out for sure, but I grew up in Virginia in like a relatively small community, so it wasn't like didn't have access to kind of high level like preparatory training or anything like that. So it was just whatever was around, and kind of pre-internet too.
Right.
It was much less accessible. You had to really seek things out and find your ways of your sources for weird music. So that sort of took a minute to come together, but once it did, and once I had teachers and like avenues for exploring that sort of stuff, and friends, older friends who would turn me on to like Ornette Coleman, when I was in high school, or just stuff that started to like open up these musical worlds. For me, I think pretty quickly from there, I started moving down a different path than just the kind of like mainstream classical zone.
Uh-huh.
And that sort of led to this field of what is sometimes called new music or contemporary, post-war 20th century music.
Yeah, right. And I mean, was that like as a teenager that you started composing that way?
Well, again, like I was really just a pianist, and then I played in like guitars and weird bands with my friends in high school. But I was in a magnet school for literature, and so I was writing text before I was writing music. That was sort of my creative outlet, and it took me a minute to want to compose, to feel that I could compose, to kind of like make that connection to like music being a really creative thing, and getting into composition, which really was not until I went to college. And looking back on that, I think there's kind of like an analogy between just recently starting to feel that I could improvise or get access to that side of it's an extension of that same gradual opening up of that sort of creative modality within this field, where I started out in this very like you're going to follow these instructions and play the page. So I really see that whole arc as like a gradual broadening out of that practice for me.
Yeah, that thing that you said about studying creative writing, I feel like more and more as a composer, I see the action very much like being a creative writer. Just using language, except it's the language of music.
Sure.
But the processes are very similar. Would you say you found that when you got into it?
I did. I think it took me a while to feel that strongly, but now I definitely do, especially having done a lot of artist residencies.
The
last time or so, and getting to hang out with writers and just see how they work. And these days, like my day and my routine is very, very structured, like a writer's. And I think that's part of the reason why it's easy for me to be in a place like we are now, which is it's less dependent on like day to day in the room interaction. It's more like I can front load or have these like concentrated bursts of like social and collaborative work, and then I need time just in these like sheltered spaces to sit at the desk and just like work all these ideas out.
To access your musical imagination, shall we say. So going back to this piece, it's obviously coming from a very specific sound world, and the music that I've listened to, that was 2016, like I said. So in the music that's more recent for you, although it has changed and grown and developed, there is something specific to your sound world. And I'm just imagining then, we got up to you going to study composition in college, and that led you to multiple degrees. And I know you studied with some really important composers in the course of that travel. Yes. One that stood out to me was Tristan Murail. And this word spectralism gets thrown around all the time. Is that something that you think about?
It is, in a way. Studying with Tristan and being at Columbia in particular during that era, with all the faculty who were there, Fred Laerdal, eventually George Lewis, while I was there, and my colleagues, maybe even more than anything, just the people who were around me.
Nice.
there. So people like Alex Minchek and Kate Soper and Mario Diaz de Leon, Steve Lehman, just a ton of really amazing creative people that I learned so much from. But yeah, spectralism as an idea was part of the reason that I came to Columbia, or that I wanted to go there. I was really interested in that that approach to writing music and that sound of Uriah and Grise and some of the other folks who are sort of related with that aesthetic. I think what was really exciting to me about that approach was that it felt like a way of reconciling some of the things that were really basic to me about what really like lit me up in terms of sound. Like it was a way of kind of reclaiming certain aspects of like very fundamental like sonority in a way that it didn't feel like it had to be erased or obscured or hidden or all the pressures that were sort of put on classical music like right after World War II, especially in the European and kind of German-centric aesthetic for completely understandable reasons. But there was something that I just found like, just in a really like primal kind of deep level, I connected with that approach to sound that spectralism offered, and also tools and techniques and like ways of thinking about the fact that harmony and timbre are a continuum, potentially, rather than separate categories. That you can think of music in terms of just an uninterrupted flow, rather than something that has to always be quantized on a kind of grid of time. And I sort of took some things from that and let others fall away, because it wasn't that I was looking for just a new aesthetic to take on or anything. But my engagement with that style, that practice, definitely formative and influential to me. And I think it shows up in a lot of ways, but in the piece we're talking about, the cello and piano piece, things about like how the cello is retuned in a very subtle way, so that the C string, the lowest string, is then put into a very, very rich and consonant relationship to the highest string, the A string. And then finding a way in which, by pressing down the two middle strings really, really hard in a very high position, you can actually flatten out the normal curved arc of the four strings of the cello into a level plane and bow all four at once. So that allows the two outside strings to be really, really rich and resonant and kind of like in a fused timbral space. But in order to get that, the two interior strings are pressed down so hard in such an unstable and tense position that it creates this kind of like really strained, intense kind of vocal quality to the overall sound. So those two things get mixed together in sort of a complex way that I find really expressive. And so I think part of those ways of thinking about what is an instrument, what is timbre, how can you work on timbre, just notes, outside of electronic music, just with acoustic music. A lot of those things are sort of, vestiges of my interaction with that way of thinking.
Did you interact with the performer a lot to get at some of these?
Yes, for sure.
Who remind me, the cello? You're playing piano, obviously. But say again.
Marielle Roberts.
Wonderful. Yeah,
who's a fantastic performer. We actually just played this piece again on Sunday for the first time in a while.
Wow.
And just reminded again what an incredible musician she is, composer, improviser, performer. But I mean, absolutely, with this piece and with every duo piece that I've written that involves myself as well, they're the products of long, like months and years processes of this other person together, like hunting for material, trying things out, me bombarding them with questions. They always, being very patient and like letting things kind of gradually evolve in a certain direction, and writing a piece, redrafting it, throwing away half of it, like really, really long, unusually long processes to get to a place where we both feel like really excited with the results. There's something in the sound and the energy that's like we found something really specific and interesting, and then we took the time to edit it all the way down until it just feels like super tight.
Yeah, it definitely does. Sounds like a good band.
Yeah.
There's also some subtle very subtle retuning of the piano, right? Only on certain notes. Is that
that's happening? Right. And again, since we're talking about spectralism still, this is a trick I basically borrowed from Grisey in a piece called...
Just for listeners, Gerard Grisey,
yes.
Grisey, also great composer.
Absolutely. He has a very famous piece called Vortex Temporum, in which he actually calls for, I think it's four or five strings of the piano to actually be retuned, but like by a piano tuner to very specific notes. But the effect that has is kind of tremendous and like much greater than you would think it is, just given how few notes it affects.
Yeah.
It changes the whole timbre of the instrument. Just like it sounds like it's being run through a ring modulator sometimes, or just crazy effects. And so recognizing that and seeing that, and then working in New York and having to be super efficient and practical with all these sorts of things, like, well, can I do that without having to get a piano tuner in, with a super precise kind of thing?
Yeah. Can you do it yourself? And then also, can you get the piano back to where it's supposed to be for the next performer?
When you install it.
Yeah.
So the solution that I gradually came up with was just to use basically like poster putty. Just stuff you can buy at like any Blick art store, just kind of gray putty. And you would use to stick a poster to a wall. It's kind of like freeform stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of goes on the strings very easily and then comes right off. And so that piece, I'm using it on 5 of the strings, and I take it and I roll up a little ball of it. And in the mid register of the piano, each hammer is attached to 3 strings.
Yeah.
So I put it over 2 out of the 3 strings. And so it detunes the string against itself.
Right.
And the string starts to beat. It sort of creates a little interference between, basically now it's 2 pitches in one.
Right.
And then from there I got, over the course of working on this over a really long time, I was at McDowell Colony residency in New Hampshire, working on this piece right around the Trump election, actually, which is part of why it sounds the way it does. But, had a lot of time to get really deep and kind of like finicky and subtle with this stuff, and realized that not only can I detune the string against itself, but if I move it, just like a centimeter away from me, it beats faster or slower. And you can actually kind of tune those things. And you start to recognize that beating is not just a function of pitch, but one of rhythm too. And since the piece is so motoric and so based on these fast rhythms, I found that I could start within these little loops. I could tune the beating of a particular note that was resonating to how fast the figure is playing. Yeah. So if I'm playing like a 10 tuplet, 10 notes within the space of a quarter note, I can actually set it so that the beating of that bass note of that is beating at 10 beats per second. And so it creates this crazy fusion between what's happening in the pitch space and what's happening in just the rhythms that I'm...
The rhythm in the interior rhythm of the timbre of the note. But you that also must take incredible accuracy to get the... I was going to call it silly putty. What did you call it? The poster putty to get it in the right spot must be.
Yeah. It takes a little bit of
Wow. Well, that's wonderful. That's fantastic. Your music has developed so much in so many different ways, and I thought I would play something from a few years later, Axamer Folio, and then we'll talk about it. But who are the performers on this?
So this is a studio recording from, I believe it's 2019, and Jonathan Holting Cohen is playing alto saxophone, and Dennis Sullivan percussion.
great players. I don't know either of them. You were going to say,
yeah, Jonathan is a just fantastic classical saxophonist. Teaches at UMass Amherst, and the sort of player for whom he's sort of coming from like a background that's like sort of French conservatory traditional playing. This is really like a big move for him into a slightly different space. Dennis is a amazing percussionist who, like a lot of new music percussionists, is, plays like anything, from drum set to marimba and vibraphone, like 4 mallet parts, to figuring out how to work with like a megaphone and bowing styrofoam and just all those sorts of things that you would be asked to do as
those percussionists.
Yep, incredibly versatile and super nice dudes.
Great. Wow, that's wonderful. And obviously a really different language for you as a composer. I know you're using sort of, for lack of a better, systems, processes, rather than what we think of as a fully notated through composed score.
Yeah, so it's kind of a hybrid in that the piece is set up, so it's a folio in the sense that it's kind of like a folder of different pieces, short pieces. What it doesn't give you from the outset is an order in which those pieces have to go, or even a selection of the whole. It's basically saying this is a big pile of things, and you can choose which ones you use and which ones you put together in the piece. And one thing that became a feature of the piece is that each movement is named after a small town in the Austrian Alps, which is just kind of a thing that happened after going to visit there and seeing that all these towns have these little one-syllable names, and a lot of them are kind of very similar to each other, and it started to suggest this sort of like labyrinthine, like map kind of structure. And so in a way, when you can think about as a performer, if you're trying to approach the piece, you're kind of just deciding what route to take. You're deciding which towns to visit and which order to visit them in, and how to sort of move around through the space. And if you don't want to go to that town, then you don't do it. And so it's sort of up to you in that way. But the pieces all generally fall within a few categories, and they share a lot of material. So I'm trying to have some sense of continuity or about what the piece is, even if the versions in which it's presented can be very, very different. And also just because it's saxophone and drum set, which was the original commission, those are two instruments where, at least in the new music world, like the players that you would get come from just the widest range of backgrounds. Relative to, let's say, violinists or pianists or someone like that. If you have a saxophonist playing new music, they could have come from like Jonathan's sort of French conservatory background, or they could be, like my colleague Alex Munchek in Wet Ink could have come from like bebop background, and have improvisation be like really fundamental to what they do. Same with percussion. You could have someone who, really is mostly playing like marimba solos, or you could have someone who, plays in metal bands and is like really a drum set player. So another feature of the piece that I wanted to build in was that sense that it had lots of openness in terms of how the players could approach it. They could choose to focus on the modules that were fully notated and through composed and make a version that's just that, if that's what was most comfortable for them and that's what they wanted. Or they could choose to focus on the modules that were more open or that explicitly invited or called for improvisation, and focus on those if they wanted to make a version that played to that strength of theirs. So that sort of multiplicity of choice is really built into the structure of the piece itself in a way that I hadn't tried to do before.
And how much did you work with them when they were first getting the piece up?
Yeah, I worked a lot with them in constructing the version. Piece. And so they said, well, we want to play these sorts of things, but what do you think is the best way to put them together, or what's the best order? And so we went back and forth a lot about that.
But it seems also like a system where they could concoct half a dozen or more different radically different performances of the material.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it could be, thousands of different possibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did they do that, or I'm just curious, like, was the idea to take your system and then get it to a fixed place where they would perform it this way? If they did it again, they would do it the same.
Yeah. I think so far it has been, different groups have approached it in different ways. So one of the original commissioners was a group called Patchwork. And what they did at first was to make a version that it seemed like they wanted to make, their version of the piece and stick with that. And so they toured that. But then they came back to the piece several years later and played a relatively different version.
Yeah.
At this point, it's been played by 6 or 7 different duos, and versions.
Well, is it always saxophone and percussion drum set?
Yes. Yeah. But originally it was only soprano saxophone, and now that's been opened up to any horn. Always drum set, but I've seen a version done that's 7 minutes long. I've seen a version done that's 28 minutes long.
Great.
Still the same title. For me, it's still the same piece.
Yeah. And you're happy to see.
Yeah. I mean, I just find it fascinating. I'm interested and gratified that people find it interesting. For me, it's just it's really fun to explore, to sort of like make a little world and then watch people explore it. It's almost like a game design or something.
Right,
like that.
right. You've mentioned Anthony Braxton as an inspiration, and I wonder if some of his approaches led you into working on things this way.
Absolutely.
At this stage.
For sure. I had been exposed to Braxton's music in the first substantial way by working with Wet Ink Ensemble on a performance of some of his Ghost Trance music pieces, which had been, we were kind of coached in by some people who had been students of his at Wesleyan at the time. So Steve Lehman and Katie Young and a couple others, Sarah Schoenbeck. So we had kind of gotten an initial taste of that world, and I was just blown away by how well it worked, how fun it was, and just how different it felt to play that music than most of the other music that I was playing. Which obviously, when you listen to my music, you know that I write music that's very about precision in a lot of cases, and so obviously that's something that I like. But as a performer, when I had the chance to play music where there was this feeling that in the moment you could listen so much more, you could feel like you could make choices and not feel lost. Which, as someone who was at that point not really improvising, was one of my anxieties about it. I just loved that feeling, and I was so impressed with how he was able to build this whole universe of music and of human interaction out of just a small set of kind of predetermined elements. And I just got, kind of hooked, I think, by those ideas. And from there I got, much more invested in exploring his writings and the history around his groups and his compositional systems. It's been a big influence for me in that domain, for sure.
This piece, modules relationships, we're going to hear Wet Ink Ensemble and talk about that a little bit, but is this something you would say similar, well, not similar thought process, but the influence of Braxton being imagining a sound world where there are choices and there's listening and there's human interaction? I hear this very much that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely just an extension of those ideas from the previous piece into a domain now where there are people who I know are fluent improvisers and who will bring something really interesting to that. So working with Sam Pluta on electronics in particular, and feeling like all I have to do is just give him a couple words and he'll do something great with it. And having myself in there as a performer and working with the group that I have the most history with. So a lot of the notation can be much more verbal. A lot of things can be we can leave them open because we trust each other and we have all of this history and we know that that something cool will happen.
It's one of the great strengths of of human interaction, but of having a band, of having an ongoing ensemble where you develop over time.
Yeah.
But it's not, as you hinted at, it's not to diminish the rigor and the precision of the writing or of the improvising, and I think to sort of demand that on both levels, you need a very special set of players. And
Right.
so I
Yeah,
think Wet Ink certainly does that. Let's hear a little bit of this. It's Modules Relationships. Just fantastic. Thank you so much. It's great. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we do.
Yeah. I guess it's the job, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the job. I mean, and do you have any more comments about that piece in particular beyond what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I guess for me, it maybe it sounds a little bit funny to folks who I imagine a lot of you and a lot of your audience are who just are improvisers and have had that background and that training and that history, just to see how just watch me taking these baby steps towards it. But coming from the background in the musical culture that some of us who studied classical music did, I think it really is kind of a slow process of deprogramming some of that stuff and end up just building new connections in your brain of things that you were never asked to do. It's almost like you have to learn this new language just to be able to access that stuff, to really force yourself to just to be able to feel comfortable with not knowing what's going to happen in the next moment, because it's so not where you're coming from. But that step for me was the next, that piece was the next step in trying to develop a relationship with improvisation within the context of the type of music that I was creating and wanted to write, and trying to do that in a way that had some sense of dialogue with some of the music that I was seeing among my friends and colleagues in the improvisation community in New York, what they were doing. And it came at a moment where I think there started to be this really interesting sense that all of the really interesting folks on this side were kind of looking at the interesting folks on the other side and saying, "Oh, I really like what you're doing. Let me get a little bit of that." And then vice versa. There was just this really nice moment of well, first of all, I think that sort of thing was possible in an authentic way because we were all hanging out together too, and it wasn't just this sense of appropriation or whatever. Going in these various directions, but just a sort of really sincere interest in a different practice and kind of an alternate history of music, and what you might be able to learn from that and how engaging with that could change or enrich with your practice.
Yeah, absolutely. But it would seem to me like part of that is a function of things becoming a lot more genre-less.
Yeah, I
Like
think that's
not,
true.
not having the expectation of any vocabulary being in a certain style language is what sort of opens that door.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that for sure has been going on in New York in particular, let's say, for the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been a gradual change over many years, over more than 2 decades for sure.
Mhm.
But I think, this music that you're making and the people in this ensemble and the people in the circles you're talking about, it's certainly a new development, both interior, psychological, but also, exterior, just technique wise. People learning different things that somebody with their training wouldn't have learned
Yeah, right.
in previous times.
Yeah, and I think that's exciting. I conducted a disc of orchestra music by Ingrid Laubrock,
Yeah,
just like almost entirely fully notated, with then just a
yeah,
few sections of kind of conducted improvisation that Taylor Hobynum
hmm,
led. And again, the vast majority of that music is fully notated, and Ingrid
yeah,
spent huge amount of time and effort studying modern orchestral writing to put that project together, and it's awesome.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
encourage it in both directions for sure, and I think it's fascinating to see what people are drawn to from that sort of the other side of, not that they're on the two sides, but that sort of other area of the practice, and what taking that into their own language can open up to them.
And it means a different thing now than it would have, say, 50 years ago,
For
or
sure.
even 30 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's interesting that over the history of the music, you keep mentioning post-war, which I'm assuming you mean World War II and not Vietnam or Korea or Grenada or Afghanistan, but yeah, starting in the early 50s, let's say, the different steps that, including improvisation or aleatoric practices, have gone through,
Yeah.
fashions, and being completely in and everyone doing it to no one doing it,
Right.
and all sorts of various gradations in between, and then musicians coming from a more purely improvised background, with other language aspects and different communities, moving into it from this, as you said, the other side. I don't want to say the other side either. You qualified it immediately. So will I, because there's a million sides. But it's really interesting in wet ink to see the way that it's being used. And if I think you're the co-director, or are you like the sole? Are you like the capo di tutti capi? In
No, we for a minute had a sort of rotating executive director position, and we still do to some extent. I'm no longer in that position now. It's generally we try to run it as a kind of non-hierarchical,
a
just
collective. That's
8
great.
members of us who are in the
Yeah,
basic band, and we're all co-directors, and we all have an equal vote in anything.
it's
Yeah.
hard to keep a group together. So now, how long has Wet Ink Ensemble been together?
Yeah, so it was Wet Ink started in 1998. I was not a part of it when it started. It came out of Manhattan School of Music, and Alex Minchek is the only current member who was a member at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But in the early days, there were people like Jacob Garchik and Dan Weiss who were involved with Wet Ink. So it kind of really started from the Manhattan School of Music Jazz program. Then when Alex came to Columbia, it sort of developed more into its current model, which he met me and Kate Soper and Sam Pluta all there while we were in grad school. And Ian Antonio and Aaron Lesser were also at Manhattan School. And Mariel Roberts joined us just a couple years ago to round out the octet. But yeah, I mean, it's been a great thing to see that over that, more than 20 years of the group's history, to see it go through these various phases, starting from a place that from the beginning, it was sort of a group that was working in the world of improvisation and kind of moved into the world of composition and new music. And now has sort of shifted to a place where it's got maybe 1 foot in each or more than 2 feet.
Or maybe it's its own thing. No.
Yeah, right.
You
And
know.
when Sam came on board, then all of a sudden there's he's so expert in the world of electronic music, and we have that whole dimension that he brings to things. And all of us have just taken different trajectories through these fields and these practices over time, and that's still evolving. Josh Mondi and Mariel Roberts now are doing a lot more composing and improvising as well, not aside from being just sort of like performers. So the group is really continuing to evolve, I think, in a way that is, at least in some part, in response not just to our own interests and things that we want to explore, but to how the community is evolving. And we want to be able to serve lots of different types of people. These days, we have a program that we've started doing where we bring in 2 or 3 people a year as our artists in residence. And a lot of those people that we've worked with so far have been improvisers, in some cases first and foremost, and in other cases as part of a hybrid identity. But we've worked with people like Charmaine Lee and Nick Dunstan and Katie Young, and more to come next year and beyond. But have felt that we need to get better at all of these things in order to be able to engage with the types of musicians that we want to, and to be able to serve and work with them on a sort of equal playing field in every aspect of what they do and what they.
That's great.
They want to work with electronics and video. If they want to work with us as improvisers, with us as performers, all of that stuff is on the table.
That's great. I mean, and in addition to that, just the organization and all the work of having an ensemble and the constant cycle of commissions and the seasons, and so that's fantastic. I mean, at this point, how much do you feel divided between being a performer and being a conductor, which I know you do a lot of, and being a composer? I mean,
I guess I like variety in my musical life. I feel like that keeps me fresh, and that all of those things feed into each other. So the performance side, the organizational side, or the administrative side, just from the standpoint of if you have to program another season, it pushes you to remain in touch with what's going on, so that you have opinions about things that you think are good, and it's not just something that sort of gets stale over time, or you run out of ideas. Like you have that responsibility, and it's a good responsibility. And so based on that, I really enjoy having periods where I'm going back and forth between these ways of engaging with music. So that the whole, in the end, I feel like when I do, when I'm writing and performing and rehearsing, workshopping with a group, working on programming concerts, playing concerts, playing other people's music, not just my own music, all of that stuff really rounds out into something that feels very whole and full to me, that you balance the sort of like self-involved nature of, the isolated nature of just being at a desk making music with the social side of performing, and the service side of working on other people's music and helping that get heard and helping that get executed at a high level. I think that's one of the ways of doing it that, for me, like over time is sustainable, just in the sense that you feel like everything that you want to be satisfied can be satisfied by this sort of thing. So I don't need another job or like another thing to work on. I can get it all within just the world of music.
Amen to that. Yes, absolutely. And now, what's more, you made a jazz record.
Well, it's on a jazz label.
Of course, I'm joking. All genre names are meaningless in my personal opinion, but it's a label, out of your head music, that is associated more with improvisation and experimental music coming out of a jazz background. There's a lot more improvisation on this. It's the album is basically 2 duos.
That's right.
Right?
Yep.
So one of them is called Field of Action. And which piece do you want to hear a little excerpt of?
Your choice.
It was interesting. We when I do these episodes of the podcast, I usually have email back and forth with the person I'm going to be talking to because I'm always interested in the music. And Eric was kind enough to send me 4 possible tracks that I could approach. And then I listened to the whole thing. I was like, well, that's funny. Why did you choose those? So anyway, I'm going to go with track 2, which is Signal. Fantastic. I mean, that's your basic voice piano duo project.
That's
right there. Yep. Charmaine Lee, I would say mostly electronics in the case of that piece, right? And actually, you're playing piano. No,
all her voice. She's just using, one of the really innovative things about how she approaches the voice is her use of microphones.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of what we work together on in this piece. Like when I'm thinking about writing for her, that's the main parameter, is which microphone is she using or which combination of microphones. So at her normal setup, she has a normal vocal mic. And then she has a contact mic held against her larynx with kind of like athletic tape. And she has that on a volume pedal, so she can fade that in and out, which gives you this crazy, like distorted, close mic'd sound. Yeah. But most of what you're hearing in that piece is she's actually singing into the microphone of an old cassette recorder, which is a super lo-fi microphone built in, and it just distorts very easily. Yeah. So a lot of what she's doing is creating just noise sounds by blowing into that, or creating feedback by holding that right against her mouth, and she can sort of shape the spectrum of that feedback. Nice. Through hours and hours of practice.
So how this piece, Field of Action, what's the procedure? How was this constructed?
So similar to the duo with Marielle that we heard at the beginning, it's the product of years of hanging out together,
going back and forth with ideas,
talking about music,
nice.
Just gradually developing ideas that felt like they were a space where we could meet each other. Like Charmaine and I are from really different backgrounds, but we sort of started orbiting around each other in New York at a certain point, and we're both really interested in what the other was doing. And she said, "Hey, can we do a project together?" And over several months, we figured out that, well, even though we don't really know how this would work, what if we tried to make a duo piece or a record? Yeah. What would that mean? What would that be like? What would we need to figure out to make that happen?
What would the language be that we would construct?
Totally.
That's great. Fantastic. Was that the same process with your other duo partner on this album?
It was, though that one I think was easier in the sense that at that point, Weston was just kind of like a straight up new music performer. And so it was a little bit more obvious of like how we would work together, that I would make a score, I was the composer.
I heard that he sought you out at one point, and
so same thing.
Basically already had the language that he was going to be working with. I mean, an extraordinary player. It's trombone.
That's right.
And does he pronounce his last name? Is it Olensky or Olenki?
He's been going by Olenki as long as I've known him.
Great. It's fantastic. We'll listen to that in a little bit, but I just thought I would ask you before we go, and thanks again for making the time. that I would just mention that a previous guest of the podcast is your wife, and you both live in Greenfield, Mass. And that's Anna Weber, the wonderful composer and reed flute player. I can imagine having the time up there to write must be a real gift.
It's wonderful.
I read a recent article about you, about this album coming out, and you mentioned in passing, you mentioned the idea of the big growth of, this being a time that the move was part of a feeling like, if the next big growth is going to happen for me, I got to get started to do it. And that's a really inspiring sentiment. And so I guess that's happening for you now with all these new projects.
Yeah, that's certainly the goal. I felt just really grateful for how welcomed I have felt from people in the improvisation community as I've, started to just try to approach these things in ways that, I could have easily imagined people feeling territorial about it or, unwelcoming. But I've, just nothing but interest and, outstretched hands and, things that have I've been really grateful for, and have also made me feel a very strong sense of responsibility to try to honor that and to try to do this at slowly, step by step, to build things up, not try to do everything all at once, but to gradually over time develop an approach and a language, a way of working for this that allows me to be a broader musician and engage with all those things that I admire so much coming from that world.
Wow, that's fantastic. I look forward to hearing you play. I know that you recently wrote a piece for brass quintet and piano that premiered at Roulette with a couple of my favorite players, Nate Woolley and Forbes Graham, right? Right. And I've been involved for 20 years now in this thing called Festival of New Trumpet Music that happens every September. And I'm now publicly approaching you to begin conversations to see if we can get that piece performed at the festival in September. I think it would be fantastic. And and then you'd be welcome at the jam session after if you want to. No, I'm just kidding. We don't have a jam. I thought I would go out with the other piece from this new album, Contraposition. Is it a reference to the positions on the trombone by any chance?
No, it's just a term from formal logic, as boring and academic as that might sound. But it's a lot to do with the way in which that piece has so many kind of chaotic energies and sound worlds to it that there's kind of a tension that we ended up trying to set up in the piece between the ways in which the formal structures work and the ways in which the material kind of unfolds and one thing follows another, with the fact that the things themselves are so wild and intense and strong that there's, an interesting kind of dynamic when you pair those particular things.
Wow. Well, it's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah.
For agreeing to talk about it and for making the time. It's just been great to dig into all this music. I really love it. So thank you so much. So this is, let's hear the beginning. Let's hear Contraposition. This is the first of 4 pieces. It's called Image. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. That's Contraposition from Eric Wubbels. And if you've come this far, it's time to go to greenleafmusic.com and get all the episodes and the entire catalog. Come on over and subscribe, and we'll see you there. Thanks.